Los Angeles, 1972. The press room is stifling under the heat of the spotlights, the air heavy with cigarette smoke. The clatter of typewriter keys mixes with the snap of camera shutters, each flash momentarily blinding. Reporters lean forward in crowded rows, restless, hungry for a headline. The Madison Square Garden triumph is still echoing through the city, but doubt lingers in the air. Is Elvis Presley truly reborn, or just a fading star grasping at one last blaze of glory? Suddenly, one journalist seizes the room. His voice cuts through the noise, sharp and mocking. "Mr. Presley, you're called a man who only uses women to polish his image. What do you say to that?" The laughter dies. The smoke seems to hang heavier. Dozens of eyes lock on Elvis, waiting for the fall. He sits still, the sparkle of the stage gone, his face drawn from exhaustion, yet carved with quiet strength. His gaze lifts, calm, steady, but carrying something deeper, something wounded. The room holds its breath. This could be humiliation. This could be history. Something is about to happen that no headline, no camera flash, no script could have prepared them for. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The 1960s had not been kind to Elvis Presley when it came to the way the media shaped his image. On stage, he was Elvis the Pelvis, the boy from Memphis whose hips seemed to scandalize half of America. Newspapers published columns dripping with sarcasm, accusing him of corrupting the morals of a generation. One syndicated writer declared in the Boston Globe, "Presley shakes more than his guitar. He shakes the very foundation of American womanhood." Another headline screamed across the Chicago Tribune, "A danger to American women." Behind the curtain of those headlines, however, lived a very different man. Elvis was the son who had grown up clinging to his mother, Gladys, with a devotion that never dimmed. He wrote her letters from the road, sent her gifts when money was tight, and in interviews often said she was the one who shaped his understanding of kindness and respect. Friends remembered that when Elvis was away, he would phone home nightly just to hear her voice. For every article calling him a seducer, there was an unpublicized moment of him sitting quietly at Graceland, watching television with Gladys, his hand resting gently on hers. The contradiction between his private tenderness and the public scandal of his stage presence became fertile ground for tabloid exaggeration. In smoky newsrooms, editors whispered that stories about Presley's effect on women sold more copies than his record sales ever could. They printed photographs of young girls fainting at concerts, deliberately framing it as hysteria, never devotion. The boy who had grown up singing hymns in church was now a threat because he smiled too warmly, moved too freely. By the mid-1960s, Elvis was tired of being painted as a villain of morality. In 1967, he attempted what many thought would settle the matter. He married Priscilla Beaulieu, the woman who had been at his side since his army years in Germany. Their wedding in Las Vegas was splashed across every magazine in America. The photographs told one story: Elvis as a settled man, committed to a single woman, finally giving his critics no more reason to brand him a reckless bachelor. But the press twisted even that. One gossip column sneered, "The king finally bows to convention," though one wonders if it's love or damage control. What should have been a new chapter of respectability instead became more fuel for rumor. When Priscilla appeared at public events looking reserved or tired, the tabloids whispered of unhappiness. When Elvis toured alone, they speculated about infidelity. Every movement, every silence was dissected. Their daughter, Lisa Marie, was presented not as a blessing, but as a question mark. Would fatherhood tame him, or expose new cracks. By 1972, the reality was far harsher than any headline. Elvis and Priscilla were living apart. The house in Beverly Hills, once filled with laughter and visitors, was now a space divided. She had moved out, and he spent long nights pacing hotel rooms in Las Vegas, trying to lose himself in music, in movies, in pills that promised rest but never delivered peace. It was into this atmosphere that the press conference arrived, a room filled with journalists who knew precisely where to press to draw blood. They had read the gossip columns. They had heard the whispers about separation. They knew the man in front of them was not only the most famous entertainer in the world, but also a husband watching his marriage unravel. So when a reporter stood up in that crowded room in 1972 and asked, with a smirk edging his voice, whether Elvis was guilty of using women for image and advantage, it was no innocent question. It was a blade sharpened over years of criticism, waiting for the moment to cut. For the audience watching on television, it might have sounded like another probing inquiry from an ambitious journalist. But for Elvis, it was a reminder of every headline that had mocked his sincerity, every article that had laughed at his tenderness, every attack that reduced his relationship with women to scandal. The question hit where he was most vulnerable, not simply because of his fractured marriage, but because it denied the deepest truth about him. For Elvis, women were not ornaments or marketing tools. They were the center of his world. His mother, his wife, his daughter, his fans. They were the ones who had written him thousands of letters when he was drafted into the army, the ones who had waited at train stations and airports to welcome him home, the ones who cried in the front rows of his concerts as though their hearts were tied to his songs. This was why the moment mattered. The press had been playing this game with him for over a decade, but in 1972, when his private life was collapsing, the same old insinuations carried a sting sharper than ever before. That single question, delivered with a smirk, was not about curiosity. It was about humiliation. And yet, there was something the reporter did not anticipate. By striking at the softest point, he unintentionally set the stage for one of the most unforgettable moments in Presley's career. Not on stage, not in a recording booth, but in a room filled with cameras and typewriters, where silence, memory, and conviction would prove stronger than scandal. The ballroom of the Las Vegas Hilton was not designed for this kind of drama. Its walls were lined with gold-trimmed curtains, the chandeliers cast a harsh white light that made every bead of sweat visible, and the air was dense with the hum of machinery, television cameras, flashbulbs, and tape recorders clicking into place. Reporters crowded into the rows of folding chairs, their notebooks open, pencils sharpened, waiting for the smallest gesture from the man at the podium. Elvis Presley entered quietly, his figure instantly commanding the room. He wore a tailored white suit, the collar high, the shirt open at the neck just enough to reveal a sliver of chain. He smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. When he lowered himself into the chair at the table before the microphones, the room shifted. The chatter subsided, and the expectation of confrontation filled the silence. The question that mattered most had already been asked. It had cut into the air like a blade, a mocking inquiry about his treatment of women, posed by a reporter whose grin seemed rehearsed. The words still lingered, bouncing from wall to wall. Cameras had caught it, microphones had recorded it, but what everyone waited for now was his response. Elvis did not answer right away. Instead, he let silence gather, a silence so sharp it seemed to scrape against the nerves of the people in the room. He leaned back slightly, hands folded on the table, eyes fixed on the questioner with a gaze that was calm and unblinking. Seconds stretched like minutes. A woman near the back of the room coughed nervously. Someone's pen clattered to the floor. The sound of camera shutters, which had been frantic a moment before, slowed to a trickle as if even the photographers feared breaking the spell. He smiled faintly, but it was a controlled smile, one that concealed more than it revealed. And then, instead of launching into a defense or lashing out as many expected, he began to tell a story. His voice was low, almost conversational, and it seemed to shrink the vast room into something smaller, more intimate. "When I was a little boy," he began, "my mama told me something I never forgot. She said, 'Son, if you ever want to know who a man really is, look at how he treats a woman, because that's the truth he can't hide.'" The effect was immediate. The smirk on the reporter's face faltered. Some of the other journalists shifted uncomfortably in their seats. No one had expected him to answer a provocation with a memory, least of all one that brought his mother into the room. For those who knew the history, Gladys Presley's name carried weight. Her death in 1958 had nearly destroyed him, and his devotion to her was a matter of public record. Elvis continued, his tone steady, his eyes drifting for a moment toward the chandelier above, as though speaking to someone who was no longer there. "She raised me to believe that women are not trophies, not ornaments. They're the ones who keep a man honest when the world tries to make him something else." The words landed heavier than any defense could have. The room shifted again, this time in his favor. Reporters scribbled furiously, but some hesitated, unsure of whether to frame this as sentiment or strategy. What had been set up as a trap now threatened to backfire. And then, with the smallest tilt of his head, Elvis steered the conversation away from himself and onto the people who had sustained him for nearly 2 decades, his fans. "You know," he said, "when I was drafted into the Army, I wondered if folks would even remember me. I thought, maybe by the time I come back, they'll be on to the next thing. But I'll tell you what happened. Every week, I got stacks of letters, thousands of them, most of them from women. Girls who wrote to say they were waiting, mothers who sent prayers, wives who said they played my records for their children while their husbands were overseas. When you get letters like that, you don't forget it." The atmosphere in the room began to change. The laughter that had greeted the reporter's jab was gone, replaced by a low current of unease. Some journalists shifted in their chairs, staring down at their notes. Others, younger ones in particular, nodded almost imperceptibly, caught off guard by the sincerity of the recollection. Elvis leaned forward, his hands resting on the microphones now. His voice gained a firmer edge. "If people think I built my career by using women, they ought to remember that women built me. When the critics said I was finished, they're the ones who kept me alive. If you've ever seen the front rows of my shows, you know who's been there through everything. They never turned their backs." It was an inversion so unexpected that the reporter who had asked the question found himself the subject of attention, not Elvis. The smirk was gone, replaced by a forced neutrality, as though he realized too late that the room had shifted under his feet. What made the moment powerful wasn't just the words. It was the pacing, the command of silence. Elvis let each phrase settle before moving on, giving the audience no chance to dismiss it. His pauses spoke as loudly as his sentences. The silence was no longer hostile. It was reverent. From the corner, a flashbulb burst, capturing him with his hands clasped, his face lit from above, eyes shadowed yet unyielding. For years, the press had caricatured him as an entertainer who thought only with his hips. Now, before their very eyes, he was redefining himself as a man who thought with memory, loyalty, and conviction. In that room, The provocation had turned into a confession, not of guilt, but of gratitude. And the longer he spoke, the more apparent it became that the reporter's question had done the opposite of what was intended. Instead of undermining him, it had allowed him to claim a kind of authority that was impossible to challenge. By the time he leaned back and let the microphones fall silent, the room felt changed. Some reporters scribbled notes with renewed urgency, sensing they had just witnessed something that would make headlines. Others sat frozen, caught in the tension of having cheered a provocation only to watch it collapse in their hands. And still, hovering under all of it, was the awareness that Elvis's words were not rehearsed. They had the rawness of truth, the sharpness of a memory that still hurt. The irony was painful. In defending his respect for women, he had unconsciously revealed how much he owed them, how much he still depended on them. And that, more than anything, left the room unsettled. The silence that lingered after his recollection of fan letters was unlike anything most of the reporters had ever experienced. In a profession where words, questions, and noise were currency, this stillness was unnerving. The room was suspended, as if no one dared breathe too loudly. Elvis let it hang there. He leaned slightly toward the microphones, his face expressionless, his eyes steady. Then, finally, with a deliberate calm, he broke the spell. "If you believe I use women," he said, his voice resonant, clear, "then you don't know me, and you don't know them. Women are not things to be used. They are not props. They are my strength, my comfort, and my life." The words landed like a crack of thunder. For a split second, there was absolute quiet. So absolute that the faint whir of the air conditioning was suddenly audible. Then came the reaction. A wave of sound, applause, nervous laughter, even a few shouts of approval, rolled across the hall. Some of the older journalists clapped awkwardly, as though they were embarrassed by their own hands betraying them. Younger ones reacted with unfiltered enthusiasm, slamming their palms together. The reporter who had launched the attack looked stricken. His pen hovered above his notebook but did not move. His grin had disappeared entirely, replaced by a stiffness around the mouth that revealed his discomfort. For him, the question had been meant to humiliate. Instead, it had given Presley a stage far larger than the Hilton ballroom. Elvis did not stop there. He pressed forward, the intensity in his voice rising. "I'll tell you something," he continued, his tone harder now. "There was a young woman once, back in the 50s. She came up to me after a show. She put a letter in my hand and walked away before I could even thank her. Later, I read it. She wrote that my music stopped her from taking her own life. She said the songs gave her a reason to keep going." He paused. For a moment, he seemed to look past the reporters, as if replaying the memory not for them but for himself. His hands trembled slightly on the table, though his voice remained steady. "You want to tell me women are just a backdrop to this career? That young lady saved me more than I ever saved her. I've had hundreds of letters like that. Thousands. And every time I read one, I remember, this is not just show business. This is people's lives." The effect was seismic. Even the cameramen, usually indifferent, found themselves frozen, their lenses pointed at a man who no longer seemed like a celebrity answering questions, but like a witness giving testimony. Some of the journalists shifted in their chairs, not from boredom but from discomfort, the kind of unease that comes when mockery collapses in the face of sincerity. Then, just as the intensity reached its height, Elvis shifted gears. He looked directly at the reporter, his expression softening into something that was almost playful, though the sting remained underneath. A faint smile curved across his lips. "And now, my friend," he said, the drawl of his Memphis roots creeping back into his tone. You tell me, does that sound like just entertainment to you? The room erupted. Laughter burst out, not cruel this time, but joyous, almost relieved. Applause followed, louder than before, joined by whistles and cheers from the younger press corps. Even a few of the hardened veterans of the beat joined in, slapping their hands together reluctantly but sincerely. The reporter who had fired the shot now looked cornered, his shoulders tight, his eyes cast down. He scribbled something in his notebook, though it was clear he was writing simply to avoid meeting Presley's gaze. And yet, in the midst of the triumph, there was something else. A shadow that only the careful observer would notice. When Elvis smiled, his eyes did not. Beneath the humor, beneath the charm, there was a flicker of sadness, a trace of fatigue that spoke of nights alone in hotel rooms, of unanswered phone calls, of a marriage unraveling beyond repair. The man who declared women his strength was, at that very moment, losing the woman who had once been his anchor. The audience, however, saw only the victory. They saw a man who had been cornered and had not only escaped, but turned the tables entirely. The moment would be replayed on television, quoted in newspapers, immortalized in bold headlines. For once, he was not Elvis the Pelvis or the scandalous showman. He was a defender, a son, a man whose sincerity cut through cynicism like a blade. Still, as the applause filled the room, his face revealed a double truth. Outwardly, he was triumphant. Inwardly, he carried a weight heavier than any microphone or spotlight. It was the paradox that defined him, the man who gave everything on stage and at the same time bore wounds too deep for even fame to conceal. The noise in the ballroom swelled until it was nearly deafening. Reporters shouted questions, some desperate to ride the wave of his response, others scrambling to repair the misstep of their colleague. Cameras clicked furiously, trying to capture the precise angle of his smile, the tilt of his head, the calm authority of his posture. But in that moment, before the room fractured into noise again, there was the memory of silence, the silence that had preceded the storm. That silence, more than the applause, was what gave his words their power. Because for those few suspended seconds, Elvis Presley had not been a performer or a headline. He had been a man telling the truth. The echo of laughter and applause still reverberated through the Hilton ballroom, but the unity of sound disguised a fracture that was becoming visible in the faces around the room. The exchange had shaken the gathering in ways no one had anticipated. What had begun as a game, a provocation designed to produce a headline, had turned into a lesson no one could ignore. Some journalists leaned forward, energized, their pens flying across the paper as they struggled to capture each nuance. They recognized history when they saw it, and the spectacle of Presley turning a hostile question into a declaration of loyalty to women was a story too rich to miss. Others sat rigid in their chairs, arms crossed, lips tight, unwilling to concede victory. For them, Elvis had disrupted the unspoken rule that celebrities must remain defensive, apologetic, or evasive when cornered. Instead, he had flipped the dynamic and exposed the shallowness of their own tactics. The reporter who had asked the original question seemed almost invisible now, buried under the shifting attention of the room. He tried to regain composure, forcing a professional smile, but his attempt to scribble notes looked mechanical, almost desperate. His colleagues were no longer protecting him with laughter. A few even glanced in his direction with something close to pity. What happened next surprised everyone. From the second row, an older journalist, known for years of biting critiques of Presley's performances, stood and clapped slowly, deliberately. The sound was measured, but unmistakable. Within seconds, others joined him. The applause, this time, was not for the showmanship of Elvis's answer, but for the unexpected candor that had disarmed the room. The reversal was complete. The supposed adversaries were acknowledging him, and in that acknowledgment, the instigator of the provocation was left even more isolated. Elvis responded with a quiet smile, nodding his head once as if to say, "That's enough." He didn't need to press further. He understood instinctively that victory in such moments came not from gloating but from restraint. Still, beneath the smooth exterior, there was a ripple of pain. He had spoken of women as his strength, his foundation, and yet the thought of Priscilla hovered like a shadow at the edge of his vision. The applause in the room felt hollow when he remembered the silence of his own home, the empty space where his wife's presence had once been. As his gaze swept across the crowded rows, it caught on a figure near the back. A woman, her hair dark, her features strikingly familiar, sat with her notebook open. For a fleeting second, she resembled Priscilla so closely that Elvis faltered. His words stuck in his throat, and the faint smile slipped. It lasted only a heartbeat, but in that instant he was no longer in the ballroom. He was back in Los Angeles, replaying the arguments, the slammed doors, the long nights when love had turned into distance. He straightened quickly, regaining composure before anyone could read the lapse. Yet the sharp-eyed among the press noticed it. To them, it was just a flicker of fatigue, perhaps a reminder of the strain he carried. But for Elvis, it was a wound reopening, even as he stood triumphant. The questioning resumed, though now the tone was fractured. Some reporters pressed forward with respectful inquiries, eager to steer the conversation toward safer ground. His upcoming concerts, his choice of songs, his future projects. Others remained adversarial, but their voices carried less conviction, as if the energy had drained from their attacks. The room was no longer unified in its view of Presley. He had forced a division. For some, he had revealed a depth that demanded respect. For others, he had broken the unspoken boundary by lecturing the press instead of submitting to it. But no one could deny the shift. The authority of the room no longer rested with the journalists. It had been claimed by the man they had sought to corner. And yet, the man himself felt none of the triumph he projected. As questions flew and cameras snapped, he sat with his hands clasped, feeling the tug-of-war between the crowd's admiration and his private despair. His words had won him a moral victory, but victories of that kind came at a cost. He had defended women as his strength, while silently knowing he was about to lose the woman who had once been the center of his strength. That was the paradox visible in his eyes. The public figure basking in approval, and the private man confronting emptiness. He offered the crowd a smile, and they responded with another round of applause. But inside, as he looked once more toward the back of the room where the familiar silhouette had been, he felt the fragile line between performance and reality blur. For the press, the event had become unforgettable. For Elvis, it had become unbearable. The press room emptied slowly, its echoes fading into the long corridors of the Hilton. Reporters carried their notebooks under their arms, their conversations low and uneasy. Some looked excited, as if they had witnessed a story larger than any headline. Others looked subdued, like soldiers retreating from a battlefield where the wrong side had won. Elvis remained at the table until the last camera was shut down, his face calm, his posture dignified. Only when the room was nearly deserted did he stand, smoothing the front of his jacket, and move toward the backstage exit. Behind the curtain, the air was cooler, quieter. The hum of the ballroom gave way to the muffled noises of hotel staff moving carts and trays. Elvis exhaled deeply, loosening his tie. For the first time since the question had been fired, he allowed himself to feel the strain of it. His shoulders sagged, and the mask of composure slipped ever so slightly. It was then that three young women approached him, journalists, but far from the hardened, cynical breed that had dominated the front rows. They hesitated at first, unsure if they should intrude. One of them finally stepped forward, clutching a small notebook. Her voice trembled. "Mr. Presley," she said, "I just wanted to thank you for what you said in there." Elvis tilted his head, curious. She went on, her words spilling faster now. "When I was in college, I went through a bad time. I didn't think I could get through it. But your song, Love Me Tender, it helped me. It made me feel like someone out there understood. And when you said women aren't things, that they're your strength, that mattered. To me, to a lot of us." The other two nodded silently, their eyes reflecting the same gratitude. Elvis's lips curved into a faint smile, but his eyes glistened. He reached out, briefly touching the young woman's hand as if to steady her, though the gesture steadied him just as much. "Thank you, honey," he said softly. "That means more than I can tell you." Their presence reminded him of the countless letters he had received over the years, but hearing it face to face, spoken with such trembling honesty, pierced deeper. The glamour of the stage could never compete with a moment like this, raw, unguarded, unplanned. Not everyone backstage shared their enthusiasm. One of his closest aides, a man who had been with him through countless tours, leaned in as the women departed. His voice was low, edged with concern. "Hey, you know how this looks? Talking about women like that? Like they're the whole story. It could soften the image. You've built this thing on fire, on being larger than life. Some folks want the rock and roll hero, not a preacher." Elvis turned sharply, his expression tightening. His voice, though controlled, carried steel. "If telling the truth makes me less of a hero, then maybe it's time people saw the man instead of the myth. I'd rather they knew what I believe than what sells." The aide opened his mouth to reply, but stopped. There was no winning this argument. Elvis's tone made clear that the line had been drawn. Minutes later, as he slipped into the waiting limousine outside the Hilton, the night air carried a faint desert chill. Crowds had thinned, but a few loyal fans still lingered near the entrance, holding cameras, waving programs. Among them was a woman in her 30s, standing with a little girl no older than 5. The child clutched a folded piece of paper in her small hand. As the limousine door opened, the girl broke free of her mother's grasp and darted toward the car. Security moved instantly, but Elvis gestured for them to stop. He leaned forward, extending his hand. The little girl placed the note in his palm and then retreated to her mother's side. The car door closed, and the limousine pulled away. Under the dim interior light, Elvis unfolded the scrap of paper. The handwriting was uneven, clearly written by the mother rather than the child, but the words were simple. "Thank you for standing up for us." He read it twice, then pressed the note flat against his thigh, his jaw tightening. He stared out the tinted window at the neon glow of the Strip, the words echoing louder than the traffic outside. For years, people had called him an idol, a sensation, a king. Tonight, a stranger had called him something else, a defender. And though the title carried no glamour, it meant more to him than all the gold records locked inside Graceland. Still, the moment was bittersweet. He had defended women before the world, but the one woman whose opinion mattered most was slipping further away each day. The irony cut deep. He had found his voice in public, only to lose it in private. The limousine rolled into the night, carrying him toward another suite, another performance, Another set of expectations. The city outside glittered, but inside, Elvis held the note in silence, his fingers curled around it like it was the only truth left unshaken. Morning in Las Vegas always carried a strange quiet. The casinos still hummed. Their neon never slept, but the desert sun stripped away the illusions of the night. Elvis woke in his hotel suite to the sound of a phone ringing. Not the usual wake-up call from the front desk, not a friend or family member. It was his manager, Colonel Tom Parker, already agitated. "Elvis!" Parker barked through the receiver. "Have you seen the papers?" He hadn't. A pile of newspapers was waiting outside the suite, delivered before dawn. Elvis shuffled to the door in his robe, picked them up, and spread them across the coffee table. The headlines screamed back at him in bold, uneven type. "Elvis defends women, a softer side of the king." "Presley stuns reporters with emotional reply." "Not just pelvis, Elvis talks respect." Some were celebratory, almost reverent, but alongside them lay others, their tone mocking. "Presley too tender?" "Rock idol turns preacher in Vegas ballroom." "From heartthrob to moral lecturer. Is the king losing his edge?" Elvis scanned them slowly, his face unreadable. He had been headline fodder for nearly 2 decades, but there was something different this time. The split was sharp, adoration on one side, derision on the other. To some, he was heroic. To others, he was a man gone soft. From the sofa, Parker paced, cigar smoke curling in the air. "You see what this does? Half the country thinks you're a saint. The other half thinks you've lost your fire. This kind of talk makes people nervous. Promoters, sponsors, they want the Elvis who shakes, not the Elvis who sermonizes." Elvis didn't answer right away. He picked up one of the sympathetic headlines, his fingers tracing the ink as though searching for something in it. "Maybe they need to see both," he murmured finally. "Maybe it's time they do." Parker slammed his palm against the table. "You're not in the business of maybe, son. You're in the business of selling tickets. Remember that." The words hung in the room like smoke, but Elvis's silence carried more weight than any argument. He had learned long ago that Parker's world revolved around profit margins. His own world was something else entirely. That afternoon, as the newspapers circulated through every barber shop, diner, and airport lounge in America, another blow landed, one that cut deeper than any review. A call came from Los Angeles. Priscilla had filed the official papers. The separation that had hung in the air like a storm cloud was now fact, ink on legal documents. Elvis listened as his lawyer explained the details, his face still, his body rigid in the armchair. When the call ended, he sat for a long time, staring at the untouched tray of room service breakfast. The eggs had gone cold, the coffee lukewarm, but he barely noticed. Defending women had been his proudest moment in years. Yet on the same day the world debated his sincerity. The woman he loved most had turned the page on their life together. Public triumph, private collapse. The paradox felt unbearable. Later that evening, in a rare quiet moment, he found himself holding one of the many envelopes that had arrived from journalists covering the conference. Most contained questions, requests for statements, or demands for interviews. But one was different. Its handwriting was uneven, its tone unexpectedly personal. "Mr. Presley," it began, "I was in the room when that question was asked. I laughed along with the others, thinking it was just part of the job. But when you spoke, you stopped me cold. I realized how easy it is for us to tear people down without ever understanding them. I want you to know I was wrong. Thank you for reminding me what honesty sounds like." It was unsigned except for a first name scrawled at the bottom, barely legible. For Elvis, it was enough. He set the letter aside, staring at it for a long time. In a sea of cynicism, one honest admission felt like a victory. Still, the ache remained. The newspapers piled high. Parker fumed about contracts. Fans sent flowers and telegrams, and yet the only silence that mattered was the one in his own home. He had stood before cameras and declared that women were his strength, and the universe had answered with cruel irony, reminding him that even the strongest needed holding, and his arms were now empty. That night, lying awake in the vast suite, the city outside pulsing with neon, he felt the gulf between the man on the stage and the man in the dark. The headlines would fade in a week. The loss of Priscilla would not. The Las Vegas Strip glittered as though the desert itself had been set on fire. Outside the Hilton, tourists posed for photographs beneath the massive marquee flashing ELVIS in towering red letters. Inside, the showroom buzzed with anticipation. Every seat was filled, the aisles jammed with waiters balancing trays of cocktails, the stage draped in heavy curtains. It was only days after the press conference, but word of Presley's response had spread like wildfire. People came not just for the music, but to see whether he would address the controversy. Backstage, the air was electric yet uneasy. Musicians tuned their instruments, adjusting strings and valves, while members of the TCB band glanced nervously at one another. Something was off. The set list for the night had been carefully arranged as usual, hits interspersed with ballads, a formula honed to perfection. But Elvis, pacing in his dressing room, seemed distant, restless. He had barely spoken during rehearsal, and when he did, it was clipped, distracted. As showtime neared, James Burton, his lead guitarist, finally asked, "Boss, are we sticking to the list?" Elvis paused mid-step. His hands rested on his hips, his gaze fixed on the floor. Then he looked up, his voice low but decisive. "No. Tonight we're doing something different." The band exchanged quick glances. They had learned long ago to follow his instincts, even when they came without warning. Moments later, the lights dimmed, and the familiar opening chords thundered through the hall. The curtain rose to reveal Elvis in a gleaming white jumpsuit, rhinestones catching the spotlights like shards of ice. The audience erupted, the sound shaking the walls. He greeted them with a brief smile, but there was no trace of his usual banter. Instead, he moved straight into the music, his voice commanding, his movements sharp and deliberate. For the first several numbers, he delivered what the crowd expected, favorites that drew cheers and clapping hands. But midway through the show, he lifted his arm, signaling the band to pause. The hall went silent. He turned toward Burton, gave a small nod, and the gentle opening notes of "The Impossible Dream" filled the room. Gasps rippled through the audience. It wasn't on the program. The song was theatrical, emotional, unlike the driving rock that made his name. Yet Elvis's face told the crowd this was not an accident. He closed his eyes and began to sing. To dream the impossible dream. His voice, rich and full, poured into every corner of the showroom. Each word seemed carved from something raw inside him. He didn't just sing the lyrics, he lived them, offering the audience a glimpse into his struggle, his longing, his defiance. The usual screams of fans fell away. No one dared interrupt. Glasses were set down, forks rested on plates. The entire room leaned in. At the midpoint of the song, he opened his eyes and looked out into the sea of faces. His expression softened, and into the microphone, almost as a whisper, he said, This is for the women who've given me strength when I had none." The effect was immediate. Some in the audience gasped. Others broke into applause mid-song, only to hush themselves again, unwilling to shatter the moment. A woman in the front row wept openly, clutching her husband's hand. Even the waiters froze, their trays balanced mid-air. The band followed him with total focus, every note precise, every chord aching. By the final line, Elvis's voice rose with such intensity it seemed to stretch beyond the walls, beyond the strip, out into the desert night itself, to reach the unreachable star. The last note hung in the air, trembling like a prayer. For several seconds, there was nothing. No clapping, no shouting, only the echo of silence heavy with awe. Then the room exploded. The applause was thunderous, relentless, waves of sound crashing over the stage. People stood, cheering, some raising their arms as though saluting him. Elvis bowed slightly, his chest heaving, his eyes glistening with emotion he did not try to hide. For him, it was not a performance. It was an answer stronger than any he could have given at a press table. The band, though seasoned veterans of countless shows, exchanged stunned looks. They knew they had witnessed something extraordinary. Burton muttered under his breath, "That wasn't just music. That was him bleeding out there." As the ovation continued, Elvis turned, lifting his hand to quiet the room. His voice was soft, almost trembling. "Thank you. That's all I need to say." The audience erupted again, but Elvis heard little of it. In his chest, a strange peace settled, a fleeting moment of clarity. He had spoken the only way he knew how, through music, stripped of defenses, raw with truth. For those in the showroom that night, it was unforgettable. They didn't just see Elvis Presley, the entertainer. They saw a man wrestling with his own storm, choosing to bear himself through a song that dared to believe in something impossible. And in that choice, he had given them more than a concert. He had given them a piece of his soul. The roar of the audience still echoed in his ears as Elvis stepped off the stage. His jumpsuit clung to him, damp with sweat, the rhinestones catching fragments of light in the narrow corridor. Behind him, the band trailed off, their instruments still humming faintly in the cavernous room they left behind. Stagehands congratulated him with nods and murmured words, but Elvis barely acknowledged them. His stride was steady, yet his face betrayed exhaustion. An exhaustion that went deeper than the body. In the dressing room, the noise of the showroom melted into muffled silence. The air smelled of powder and leather chairs, mixed with the faint sting of hairspray. He sat heavily at the vanity, unbuttoning the collar of his suit, wiping his face with a towel. The mirror reflected not the triumphant king of rock and roll, but a man with damp hair plastered to his forehead, lines etched deeply into his cheeks, his eyes weary. The door creaked open. A young journalist, one who had been allowed backstage with rare permission, stepped hesitantly inside. She wasn't carrying a camera or a microphone. Her notebook was tucked under her arm, forgotten. "Mr. Presley," she began softly, "I just wanted to tell you, tonight wasn't just a show. You changed people in that room." Elvis looked up slowly, meeting her gaze in the mirror rather than turning fully. His lips curved faintly, but his eyes stayed heavy. "Did I?" he asked, his voice quiet. "Sometimes I wonder if I change anything at all." She shook her head firmly, her voice steadying. "No, you did. When you sang that song, when you said it was for the women who gave you strength, it wasn't entertainment. It was truth. People don't forget moments like that." For a long moment, Elvis said nothing. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the vanity, his fingers interlaced, eyes lowered. Finally, he spoke, his words carrying the weight of confession. "You know something? Folks think I'm the strong one, the idol, the star, the hero. But the truth is, I've needed women to hold me up more times than I can count. My mama, Priscilla, the fans out there in the seats. They've carried me, not the other way around." His voice wavered, not with weakness, but with honesty stripped bare. He reached into the pocket of his robe, pulling out a worn leather wallet. From it, he slid a small, faded photograph. Gladys Presley, smiling faintly, her eyes full of the same warmth that had anchored him as a boy. He held it up with trembling fingers. "She's still with me," he said quietly. "Every night. Every time I step out there. And maybe that's why I can't stomach people saying I use women. I wouldn't be alive if it weren't for them. I sure as hell wouldn't be standing on a stage." The journalist's eyes glistened, though she tried to hide it. She scribbled nothing. She simply stood there, absorbing the words as if they were meant for her alone. Elvis slipped the photo back into the wallet and shut it with a soft snap. He leaned back in the chair, exhaling slowly. The exhaustion etched across his face softened for just a moment, replaced by a strange peace. "You want to know the truth?" he asked suddenly, his tone quieter, almost conspiratorial. "The hardest thing isn't singing in front of thousands of people. It isn't being on TV, or in the movies, or even facing those reporters. The hardest thing is going back to an empty room when it's over. That's when the silence feels bigger than any crowd." The journalist lowered her eyes, unable to reply. She had expected the king of rock and roll. Instead, she had found a man bearing his loneliness, his gratitude, his dependence on the women who had shaped him. A knock at the door interrupted them. One of his aides poked his head in, announcing that the limousine was waiting. Elvis nodded, rising slowly, stretching his shoulders as though preparing to carry the weight again. He turned to the young journalist, his expression gentle. "Don't write all that down," he said with a faint smile. "Some things are better left between us." She nodded, clutching her notebook to her chest, knowing she had witnessed something few ever would. A moment when Elvis Presley was not a headline, not a spectacle, but simply a man, speaking from the heart. He left the dressing room, the sound of his footsteps fading down the corridor. The journalist stood alone, staring at the empty chair where he had sat. The towel draped carelessly across the vanity, the faint scent of cologne lingering in the air. For her, it was clear. The man the world called a king had just revealed himself as something rarer. Someone who found strength not in adoration, but in the love and presence of women who believed in him, even when he struggled to believe in himself. Weeks passed, but the aftershocks of that press conference had not faded. Elvis's words had been replayed on television and quoted in print, debated in smoky bars and whispered in church halls. Some praised him for standing tall, others dismissed him as sentimental. Yet everywhere, people remembered. For Elvis, though, the clamor outside was far less important than the storm within. His shows continued, his voice filled concert halls, but each night ended in solitude, the applause dissolving into the quiet of empty suites. Then came another press gathering, smaller this time, but no less tense. The hotel ballroom was once again filled with rows of reporters, cameras poised, tape recorders waiting for a soundbite. The memory of the last confrontation still lingered. The atmosphere was cautious, as though everyone feared sparking another unexpected blaze. Elvis entered wearing a dark suit this time, his hair slicked back neatly, his movements measured. There was no swagger, no hint of the showman, only a calm presence that demanded attention. Questions began, polite and restrained. They asked about his upcoming shows, his health, his plans for touring. Elvis answered with courtesy, his tone even, his words simple. The room, however, remained restless, each journalist waiting to see whether anyone would dare revisit the wound that had electrified the world weeks earlier. And then it happened. The same reporter, the one whose smirk had once ignited a storm, rose from his chair. The room froze. All eyes turned toward him, pens poised, cameras angling in anticipation. His voice, however, carried none of the swagger it once had. It was subdued, almost hesitant. "Mr. Presley," he began, clearing his throat, "I want to say something. At the last conference, I asked you a question that was meant to embarrass you. I was wrong. I judged without understanding. And I want to thank you for reminding me, and maybe all of us, that respect matters more than a headline." Gasps rippled through the room. This was no ambush, no provocation. It was an admission of failure, a journalist laying down his weapon in front of the very man he had sought to wound. Elvis looked at him for a long moment. His face remained composed, but his eyes softened. He did not smile, nor did he rush to fill the air with words. Instead, he simply nodded once, a small gesture heavy with meaning. The silence that followed was staggering. Dozens of reporters sat frozen, unsure whether to clap, to write, or to breathe. The whir of the cameras seemed to vanish. The scratching of pens ceased. It was as if the entire room had been suspended in time, bound by the power of a gesture so simple, yet so final. Elvis did not elaborate, did not gloat, did not extend the moment into theater. His silence was deliberate, purposeful. It conveyed more than any carefully crafted statement could. Forgiveness without indulgence, strength without arrogance. In that silence, he rose above the argument, the gossip, even the headlines. The reporter lowered his gaze, humbled, and sank back into his chair. For the first time in years, the press corps found itself without a script. They were not controlling the story. They were part of it, swept into a moment larger than themselves. Elvis leaned back slightly, folding his hands in front of him, his face calm, his posture unshaken. He answered a few more practical questions, but the energy in the room had shifted entirely. No one dared push further. The conference wound down with none of the fire of the last one, but the weight of its silence was unforgettable. As he rose to leave, chairs creaked, cameras snapped nervously, but no one spoke. He walked steadily toward the exit, the click of his shoes on the floor echoing louder than the applause of any crowd. At the door, he paused for half a heartbeat, then disappeared into the corridor. When the room exhaled at last, one journalist whispered under his breath, just loud enough for those nearby to hear, "He didn't win with words this time. He won with silence." And so the narrative began to shift. In the weeks that followed, the papers no longer printed only caricatures of Elvis the entertainer. A new image emerged, of a man who could command respect not by spectacle, but by dignity, not by rebuttal, but by restraint. The same public who once mocked him now whispered about his grace, his ability to disarm without a single word. For Elvis, it was never about image, it was about truth. The truth that strength could be quiet, that dignity did not require applause. He had carried himself through storms of laughter and doubt, and in the end, he left behind something greater than spectacle. He left behind silence that spoke louder than song.